Okay guys, the next thing we're going to talk about is the types of fat used in baking. Now the type of fat that you use depends on what properties you're going for. One of those properties is nutrition, and this isn't a nutrition class, but this is relevant for a food scientist because you might want to use different fats based on the nutrition goals of your consumers. So saturated fats, you'll remember, are these long straight ones that have two hydrogens on every carbon molecule, every carbon atom in the chain. And because they're long and straight, they stack together evenly and they are solid at room temperature. Saturated fats are mostly found in animal foods, such as dairy, meat, poultry, and eggs. They are also found in big amounts in tropical plant oils, like palm and coconut. And you'll also see a little bit of saturated fat in your vegetable oils, but that'll be in much, much smaller amounts than in your animal foods and your tropical plant oils. A healthy diet is low in saturated fat because saturated fat increases your cholesterol levels, and that gives you a higher risk of heart disease. So the goal is to have a diet low in saturated fat. On the other hand, your body does need some monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat. Remember, these fats are liquid at room temperature because they have this bend in the middle and they don't stack together as evenly. And so they like to be liquid at room temperature. And these fats are typically found in plant oils, so think olive oil and canola oil and peanut oil. Those will have a lot of unsaturated fats. They are also found in fish. A healthy diet has both monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. Now, different types of fats have different properties, and that changes how they will function in a recipe. So one of those properties is plasticity. Plasticity is the ability of a fat to be molded, shaped, or spread. And I want you guys to remember that because that's very important for this video. Plasticity is really a range of temperatures. So think your butter cannot really be spread straight out of the refrigerator. You have to get it up to, say, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But then it melts at around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So butter's plastic range, the range where it's easy to spread, but it hasn't turned into a liquid, that would be its plastic range. And plastic range is very important for baking. Another property that's really important for baking is creaming ability. And creaming ability is the ability of a fat to hold air pockets when it's whipped or beaten or creamed. So if you've ever made a cake or cookies from scratch, you start out by creaming your butter with your sugar. And what that is doing is it's incorporating little bits of air into your butter so that your cookies or cake end up with a lighter texture because they have all those little air bubbles in them. So remember plasticity and creaming ability, and we're going to talk about those for each of our different kinds of fats. First is butter. Butter is milk fat and it's produced by churning cream. As far as nutrition goes, it is high in saturated fat, and that means that it is solid at room temperature. However, you'll see on here that I said it has a low melting point. That is in comparison to shortening or lard. Butter melts at a much lower temperature than shortening, and that means that it is not as plastic. Remember, plastic means that it can be spread or molded. It does, on the other hand, have a good creaming ability. And so because it has a good creaming ability and I guess it's more of a moderate melting point, it is very versatile and flavorful, and it's good for cakes and cookies and quick breads. One thing that manufacturers might do to add flavor is they might add a live bacterial culture, and so your label will say that it's cultured butter. That's just a flavor. That's just a difference of flavor. There's also whipped butter. That just means it's had air beaten into it so that it has a lighter texture. Now, margarine is very similar to butter, but it's made from vegetable oils. And it also has a small amount of water in it. Water is incorporated into margarine with emulsifiers. Remember, emulsifiers help oils and water to mix. Now, butter and margarine have a pretty similar amount of water and oil in them, but margarine has to have milk powder and bacterial cultures added to mimic the flavor of butter. As far as nutrition goes, margarine used to contain high levels of saturated and trans fats because it was made of partially hydrogenated oils, but a lot of margarines have actually been reformulated to be healthier for consumers. And so you'll see a lot less saturated and trans fat than you used to. And often they're even lower in saturated and trans fat, or they have no trans fat and they're lower in saturated fat than butter. Your properties of margarine are very similar to butter. It has a fairly low melting point compared to shortening, but it has a good creaming ability, and that makes it very versatile. You can make specialized margarine as well. Sometimes manufacturers will alter their process a little bit so that they can make margarine with different properties. One of those things is they can give it better creaming ability, and that would be your cake margarine has a better creaming ability. You can also make margarines with a better plastic range, and remember, plastic range means that it can be molded at a larger range of temperatures. And that makes it really good for pastry, because with pastry, you want your fat to be in layers. You want your fat to cling together without melting into your dough. And so if you have a good plastic range, that will allow it to make those layers, and you'll end up with a really flaky product. Next, we're going to talk about lard. Lard comes from the fatty tissue in pigs. As far as nutrition goes, it is high in saturated fat, and it is higher in saturated fat than butter or margarine. Now, this means that it is solid at higher temperatures, and that means that it's got a high plasticity range, or a large plasticity range. It's even moldable at cold temperatures. Sometimes you'll take butter and you'll try spreading it onto bread at right out of the fridge, and that doesn't really work. But even at cold temperatures, lard can be spread. And that makes it really good for pie pastry. Like I said in the last slide, you want your fat in a pastry to form layers without melting into your dough. And lard is really good for that because it has a large plastic range. You might also see lard used in yeast doughs or for greasing pans, but it's not good for cakes because it has a more fibrous texture and it has an overpowering flavor. Shortening is very similar to lard, except that it's made from vegetable oils, and manufacturers will alter the oils so that it has pretty similar properties to lard. Shortening used to be made from partially hydrogenated oils, just like margarine, but it's been reformulated to be healthier for consumers. Like I said before, its properties are similar to lard. It does have a high smoke point, which means it's good for frying. It won't burn up as much as some of your other fats. It has a lot more fat than butter or margarine. Butter and margarine have a little bit of water mixed into them, but shortening really doesn't have much water at all. Shortening is also high in monoglycerides. If you remember, a triglyceride has 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule, while a monoglyceride has 1 fatty acid attached to a glycerol molecule, and monoglycerides blend better with starches and sugars. Now, this means that shortening mixes in really well with your batter. Shortening can also be formulated to have a really high melting point and a really wide plastic range, and that makes it really good for pastries. You can also add emulsifiers to shortening. Sometimes you can buy emulsified shortening that is really good for blending into batters because it is already emulsified with water. Vegetable oils are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They're just oils from plants. And if it's labeled vegetable oil, it probably contains a blend of oils from different plants. Oils are liquid at room temperature, which should tell you they are high in unsaturated fats. They have a very small plastic range and very low creaming ability because they have such a high melting point, so they really can't be used to replace your solid fats in baking. They won't mold as well and you'll end up with too dense of a texture. But they can be used for muffins or quick breads, things that use baking powder or baking soda, because your baking powder and baking soda are actually going to produce those little bubbles for you during baking, and so you don't need to incorporate as much air into your product during mixing. Finally, we've got our deep frying fats. These have undergone special processing that give them a very high smoke point. It also gives them a neutral flavor so that they won't alter the flavor of your fried foods, and they're less greasy when they're cool, so they're good for finger foods. Often they'll also have an anti-foaming agent added. If you ever cook pasta, you know sometimes it'll foam up and make a mess of your pan. And sometimes the same thing will happen with fried foods, and so they'll just add an anti-foaming agent to prevent it from foaming up and bubbling over the edges of the pan. So those are the main types of fats used in baking. For our last slideshow, we're going to look at some of the functions of fat in baking.